Okay, so for part 2 of the puff sleeve sample, we're going to now do our buttonhole, our button, and set in our sleeve as well. So for the buttonhole, you should have done the buttonhole sample before you do this. And what you need to do is mark the halfway point in your cuff. So I've just used a lead pencil and a ruler to draw that in. I'm just going to redraw it. Now, because we have a buttonhole at the end of a cuff, we're going to have to work out the size of the buttonhole before we work out where to actually stitch it. And I'll explain that in a moment. Now, looking at your sleeve, you should have the tab for your button, which goes underneath. And once your cuff is finished, it should sit like that. So make sure you draw your line for your buttonhole on this section where it's flush with the opening. So I've set up my machine to do the buttonhole. So I've got my buttonhole foot on there. I've got it on the right settings. I've got it on 2.5 and about half, a little bit less than half. And what I've done is I've practiced the buttonhole. Now, don't forget, when you do your buttonhole, you need your button sitting in your buttonhole presser foot. Alright, and I'm just going to measure my buttonhole. So it's about 1.8. So on here, I need to work out, because don't forget the machine stitches it backwards, and I'm going to start from this end and stitch that way. If you start from this end and stitch that way, there's nothing here for your machine to grip to, so it will get stuck and will struggle to pull the fabric through, because don't forget this is quite bulky here, it's very thick. So I'm going to stitch from this side back, and I want my buttonhole to finish about here, so I'm going to start it about there. I'm just going to draw a little mark, or I could just remember it's at that point on the heart because I've got a pattern. Okay, so over to my machine. So remembering that it stitches backwards, I'm going to pop my little cuff under. It is very thick, like I was saying before. I'm going to find my mark where I want to start, and I'm going to pop my needle in. So you know how your needle goes side to side like that? So you need to pop your needle down on one side of your line, depending which way it's going. Now hopefully this is going to stitch in place. I've lined up my edge of my cuff with the edge of my foot here, so it's nice and parallel. But it can be a little bit hard to predict when you have a bulky end like we do. Alright, but let's give it a go. Okay, so that's finished, and we can have a look at our positioning for our buttonhole. That's not too bad. It stopped just before that bulky section, which is good because the machine may have struggled with that. And when I overlap that, that's going to be in a good position for the button. So next what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this open and line up my button to stitch that. So I've cut open my buttonhole, and now to work out where my button's going to go, I'm going to place my cuff on top so that my slit edges meet and my cuff is all in line. Now with the lead pencil, right in the end of the buttonhole, I'm going to do a little dot. Okay, which is there. That should sit roughly in the middle of your tab. Okay, and I can sew my button on. So I'm ready to sew my button. So I've put it to zigzag stitch, and I've put this at 3. I may need to change this, and that at 0. You'll see that I don't have a presser foot on my machine. Now I've got 2 holes, so I'm going to put the holes so that they run the same way as the buttonhole. Place it on my mark that I've done. Pop it under my foot. And I'm going to put a needle in one of the holes before I put the foot down. Pop the foot down, and then I'm going to check my stitch width. That seems fine because it goes into the other buttonhole easily. And then just with your hand wheel, stitch it in place, maybe like with 20 or so stitches. Okay, that's good. And then you can trim your threads. And should be able to do up your button now. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now the next step, we had these notches on our sleeve for our gathering. So we have a couple notches here, either side of the seam for the sleeve. So this is the front notch, this is the back notch. We know that's a double notch. And then when we move along, we have our gathering notches here, our center notch, and our other gathering notch. So that's where we're going to put our gathering stitch, between that notch, past the center notch, and to this second notch. If you come back down and you're getting close to the seam, you've gone too far. So remembering our gathering stitch is straight stitch, our maximum straight stitch. Put my foot back on. And remembering when we gather, we need to leave long tails. So I've got my double notch for my back, and this is the notch I'm going to start at. We need to leave long tails and no reversing. So I'm going to do one stitch that's relatively close to the edge. Just double checking where I'm stopping here. Leaving nice long tails. Oops, it's kind of gathered it a little bit for me already. And then I can do that other stitch right next to that one I've done, but I'm going to do it a foot's width away from that stitch. Again, leaving nice long tails, and then cut. So I've got my gathering stitch ready, and the next thing I need to do is organize my little bodice pieces to actually insert my sleeve. So if you look here, I've got the back and I've got the front. Now I know the difference because the front has a more curved armhole, right? It's also only got a single notch. The back has a shallower curved armhole, and it has the double notch. So what we need to do, we're going to overlock these seams all separately, and then we're going to stitch them together. So we'll stitch our side seam and we'll stitch our shoulder seam up here and open those seams and iron them. So I'm going to do that now, and I'll come back and show you what that should look like. Okay, so I've done that. I've done my side seam, ironed it open, and I've done my shoulder seam and ironed it open. And this section here is where the sleeve is going to be inserted. So to insert the sleeve, we need to have some pins, and we need to have right sides facing. So I'm going to pin our underarm seams together first. So I'll place that on top, line up my seams, see there, and put a pin through that point. I'm pinning this with the bodice section, like the body of the garment, on top, because that's the way we're going to sew it, with the body of the garment on top. Next part, I'm going to find the shoulder seam and that center notch, which must be along here somewhere. A little bit hard to find. So I know I've got that notch. And I've got that one, so it must be in the middle somewhere. Ah, there it is. It's very hard to see that. So that part is going to get pinned, so it lines up with the shoulder seam. I'm just going to turn that around so I can pin it with the body of the garment on top. Then other areas we can also match up are our notches here. And then our notch here, which shows where we're gathering it. And then go back around to the other side, match those notches. And the gathering notch. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to gather by pulling those top threads, just like before, that section, so it fits. Now I'll do that off camera and then show you what it should look like. Okay, so I've gathered those sections so that they fit in, and I've just made sure they're nice and even, and then I can stitch my sleeve. It's a little bit tricky. And I'm just going to rearrange it. So what I've done is I've just turned it inside out, so the body of the garment's on the inside. It just makes it a little bit easier to get under the machine when you stitch it together. So using a centimetre seam allowance, make sure there's nothing in the way. I can take that pin out and I can stitch around my sleeve. You just got to make sure you're just stitching the two layers together, and take your pins out as you go around. There's lots of threads everywhere from our gathering, but we'll trim them off after or unpick them if we need to. It's a little bit hard to get that one. Now when you do your sleeve, it probably won't be this hard, because what we're doing is like a real small version of a sleeve. So it is kind of a little bit fiddly to get under the machine because of the size. Now you can see here, I'm just going to put my needle in and check my edges are actually lining up, because they're kind of not at the moment. Alright, so I've just pulled out that bottom edge here to line it up. That's one thing you need to make sure you're doing, is matching your raw edges. So all two layers are lined up nicely. Oops, I'm just going to pull that one. Now I'm almost at the end, back to where I started. So I'm just flattening the fabric as I go around so I don't have any tucks. And then I'm back at where I started, so I'll do a little reverse stitch. Okay, so I've attached my sleeve, just checking everything looks good. Yeah. So I can turn it back around. And that's my little puff sleeve with the gathering at the top of the sleeve head. Now I've got this gathering line here, so I should, if I can, pull that out or unpick it. You can find the end, there's the end. And the very last step is to overlock that seam you've just sewn. So you overlock all the stitches together and unpick that gathering stitch. So when you overlock, turn it back around so you just have the raw edges showing. I'm just getting rid of some of these gathering threads. And then I'll overlock that. Oh, I think most of them will come out, which is good. So I've overlocked that seam all the way around with just a little overlap, and that is the finished puff sleeve.